Reign of Fire, dragons are not magical creatures, noble beings from legend, or fantastical monsters that exist only to give shape to myths. In this film, dragons are something far more dangerous than that. They are a real species within its universe, prehistoric, predatory, highly aggressive, and perfectly adapted to destroy ecosystems on a global scale. And basically, what humanity believed for centuries to be stories about knights, castles, and winged creatures were actually faded memories of real encounters with a creature that never completely disappeared. The film begins by playing precisely with that idea. Before showing us the apocalypse, it presents the dragon as a figure rooted in medieval iconography. St. George facing the beast, ancient stained glass windows, religious legends and stories of heroes that humanity eventually reduced to simple myths over time. But that vision of the past changes completely when the story takes us to modern-day London, a city built upon centuries of history, beneath which the creature that inspired all those legends remains hidden. During the construction of a new line for the London Underground, a group of workers discovers an unmapped subterranean cavern. Quinn, who is only a child at the time, enters the area without realizing that he has just crossed the boundary between human history and a much older threat. Here we can see that the cave walls do not look normal. They have a strange texture, as though they had been melted by temperatures that could only come from active volcanic hotspots, something that has not existed in the United Kingdom for at least 60 million years. And deep within that place, after hibernating for millions of years, lies a dragon. That detail is important because the creature was not simply sleeping in an ordinary cave. If we follow the logic of the film and its biology, that underground chamber functioned more like a completely airtight hibernation capsule, created by the dragon itself to remain alive for a length of time that would be impossible for any other known animal. Before entering that state, the dragon may have burned the entire interior of the cavern, eliminating any bacteria, fungi, parasites, or other forms of life that could have affected it while its body remained defenseless. The heat would have melted and vitrified sections of the walls, sealing the cracks and creating a stable, enclosed, and hidden environment. That is why, when the humans open the chamber, they do not simply discover its nest. They also break the seal that had kept it in hibernation. As fresh air enters, the temperature changes, the internal balance is disrupted, and the dragon awakens. At first, the creature appears confused, heavy, and clumsy, possibly as a side effect of its prolonged hibernation. Because of this, the liquid in its mouth, which it uses to create fire, drips irregularly, and its first attack seems more like an instinctive reaction than an actual hunt. That explains why Quinn survives. The dragon had not yet fully recovered and was still drowsy. What lands on his face is only one of the two substances the animal uses to generate fire. It irritates his eyes but does not cause any serious damage. If the dragon's glands had functioned in perfect synchronization, Quinn would have died at that very moment. However, the dragon does not take long to recover and begins unleashing its fire. Quinn's mother dies during the escape, and that moment becomes the character's first major trauma. But on a larger scale, it also marks the beginning of the collapse of the world as humanity had known it until then. The dragon that awakened beneath London was not an isolated creature, but the trigger for a cycle that had already occurred before. According to the film's mythology, these creatures had existed since prehistoric times and were responsible for one of Earth's greatest mass extinctions, the disappearance of the dinosaurs during their Cretaceous period. In other words, the dragons did not appear specifically to attack humanity. Humanity simply happened to be living on the surface when it was forced to endure this new extinction event. The premise is simple but brutal. Dragons are a species that appears when the planet is full of life, when there are animals, forests, vast ecosystems, and enough food to sustain their expansion. The male then awakens and locates the females that had also remained in hibernation. From that point onward, the species reproduces, fills the skies, sets the surface ablaze, and devours everything it finds. They do not hunt like ordinary predators that form part of a food chain. They hunt like a plague. They destroy the planet's ecological balance, and when there is nothing left on the surface for them to consume, and the Earth has been reduced to ashes, the dragons themselves enter a phase of collapse. It is important to note that the oceans were probably among the last refuges for life on Earth. although the film never directly explains what happened to marine life. The dragons may have captured fish, birds, and marine animals near the surface, but they were not adapted to hunt in the depths. Even so, the sea was not spared. Because of the nuclear weapons used by humanity, the scorched earth strategy, and the fires caused by the dragons themselves, pollution and ash would have partially blocked sunlight and severely reduced phytoplankton populations, potentially causing the collapse of marine food chains. That is one of the most interesting aspects we are shown about these dragons. They are not an ecologically balanced species. They do not preserve their food, coexist with other ecosystems, or appear to have any visible natural limit. They are too efficient, too destructive, too aggressive, and above all, too long-lived. However, their own efficiency condemns them to destroy the world they need in order to survive. That is why, after devastating the planet, their population begins to decline dramatically. The dominant male consumes the females, the starving females attack one another, and the species begins to consume itself. It is a brutal way of continuing the cycle when there is nothing else left to eat, and it strongly reminds me of the bioraptors from Pitch Black. This phase of cannibalism could also be connected to their hibernation. The film does not explain it directly, but one interesting theory is that dragon tissue contains substances capable of altering their metabolism. If the male consumes enough females, his body accumulates the compounds necessary to enter a state similar to suspended animation. The surviving females, by feeding on other dead or weakened dragons, could also reach that same state. In this way, the species does not become extinct when it runs out of food. It simply returns to dormancy and waits until the Earth recovers enough biomass to begin a new cycle. That is why the dragons in Reign of Fire are not presented as creatures of fantasy, but as a force of nature, a reset mechanism built into nature itself. Now, if these creatures have existed for millions of years, several obvious questions arise. Why has humanity never discovered dragon fossils? Why are there no complete skeletons, remains, or clear evidence of such a destructive species? The most interesting answer lies in their anatomy. For an animal of that size to fly, its body cannot function like that of an ordinary terrestrial reptile. It needs a structure that is lighter, more flexible, and more resistant. That is why it has been proposed that dragons may have had skeletons made primarily of cartilage, rather than the hollow bones found in birds. This is not entirely absurd when we compare them to real animals such as sharks, whose skeletons are not made of bone like those of many other vertebrates, but of cartilage. In dragons, a structure like this would reduce their weight and allow them to fly more easily. Their enormous wings, elongated bodies, and musculature would be designed to move through the air with speed and precision. At the same time, this anatomy would also explain the absence of fossils, since cartilage is not preserved in the same way as bone. Over millions of years, most of the body would decompose without leaving any clear traces behind. Perhaps only teeth, hardened fragments, or isolated remains would survive, which any paleontologist could mistake for those of an unknown dinosaur or another unclassified animal. In this way, the film provides a fairly convincing explanation. The other major feature that distinguishes these dragons is their ability to produce fire. Basically, these creatures possess two completely separate glands at the back of their throats. One would produce a highly concentrated oxidizing substance, probably similar to hydrogen peroxide, whose function would be to provide the oxygen needed to accelerate combustion. The second would store a liquid fuel rich in phosphorus or highly flammable organic compounds. As long as both substances remain separated, the dragon is safe, but when it opens its mouth to attack, it expels them simultaneously through two different ducts. The liquids mix only after leaving the throat and cause a hypergolic reaction, meaning that they ignite immediately without requiring an external spark. In this way, the dragon produces the stream of fire seen in the film without burning its own tissues from within. This would also explain why Quinn survived his first encounter. The creature, still disoriented after awakening, spat only one of the compounds at him, which could not ignite on its own. This mechanism is inspired by real animals such as the bombardier beetle, which keeps two substances separate and combines them only when attacking or defending itself. Their feeding habits are also directly connected to fire. Dragons can capture and devour animals or human beings using their jaws and claws, but they generally set their prey, or even the surrounding terrain, on fire before consuming the charred remains. This can be seen when one of the females attacks Quinn's crops. She first devours one of the men, then burns the entire harvest, and finally descends to feed on the ashes left across the field. However, this does not necessarily mean that they can survive by consuming ashes with no nutritional value. They most likely feed on the organic matter that remains mixed with the ashes: charred meat, fat, plants, seeds, and other partially burned remains. Basically, their digestive systems appear to be adapted to extracting nutrients from carbonized material. And this, of course, explains why humanity's response ultimately made the situation worse. By bombing cities and resorting to a scorched earth strategy, humans not only destroyed their own food sources, but also covered the planet with carbonized remains that the dragons could consume. In other words, while humanity was trying to kill them with fire, it was turning the world into one enormous feeding ground for them. However, at the risk of sounding repetitive, it was when those resources began to disappear, almost 2 decades later, that the dragons started resorting to cannibalism, proving that they could consume both other species and the bodies of their own kind. Their diet, therefore, did not depend solely on ashes, but on any organic matter they could hunt, burn, or find among the ruins. Precisely because of this, the modern world ceased to exist within a matter of years. There were no longer any governments capable of controlling the situation, large-scale organized armies, or safe cities. Humanity was reduced to isolated groups simply trying to survive among the ruins of a burned world. And it is within this setting that we encounter Quinn again, now an adult and the leader of a community hidden inside a castle in Northumberland. This image is especially interesting because it shows how history came full circle. Modern humans built skyscrapers, underground trains, machines, weapons, and cosmopolitan cities, but in the end, they returned to castles. They went back to the same kind of refuge their ancestors had used to defend themselves. Here, Quinn does not live like a hero. All he cares about is keeping his people alive. His community tries to grow food, preserve seeds, protect the children, and avoid drawing attention to itself. Going too far could attract a dragon and reveal their location. Moving carelessly in this world could condemn everyone. That is why Quinn acts cautiously, but not cowardly. He has already seen what these creatures can do, and knows that a single mistake could destroy years of effort. The problem is that his community is starving. Some survivors want to harvest the crops early because they cannot wait any longer. Quinn tries to stop them because he knows that if they consume the seeds, they will not have another harvest. But hunger does not always listen to reason. When a group goes out in search of food, they attract the attention of a dragon, and the creature destroys the crops. Suddenly, Quinn's situation becomes desperate. It is then that Denton Van Zandt appears with his group of American dragon hunters. Van Zandt is presented as Quinn's opposite. Where Quinn seeks to hide, Van Zandt seeks to attack. Where Quinn thinks about preserving what little remains, Van Zandt thinks about ending the war once and for all. His group has traveled while hunting dragons, learning their patterns and exploiting their weaknesses. And although his methods are extreme, they also prove that the dragons are not invincible. They are strong, intelligent, and lethal. But they are still animals with biological limitations. That is why the main weakness that Van Zandt has discovered lies in their vision. Dragons can see very well during the day and even better at night, but at dusk they go through a brief period of adjustment. The light is no longer sufficient for their daytime vision, but it is still not dark enough for their night vision to work at full capacity. During that interval, they lose precision, judge distances less accurately, and can make fatal mistakes. It is a small vulnerability, but one that is sufficient for a hunter who knows how to exploit it. Van Zandt puts this knowledge into practice when a female appears near the castle. His men use the helicopter and several tracking points to locate her, while Quinn helps restore one of those devices and later draws the creature toward them while riding a horse. Eventually, Van Zandt manages to bring her down with one of his projectiles. The carcass remains near the castle and curiously ends up serving another purpose. According to Quinn, dragons hate the smell released by the dead bodies of their own species, meaning that the stench could keep other dragons away for several days. Basically, the body functioned as a natural repellent. Later, when Quinn returns to examine it, he discovers an egg containing a developing offspring inside the female. This discovery confirms that the creatures Van Zandt had been hunting for years were reproductive females, and leads to the discovery of the species' greatest weakness. Because, in reality, their greatest vulnerability does not lie in their eyesight, but in their dependence on a single male for reproduction. Known as the bull dragon, this individual is much larger than the females, and is distinguished by his horns, tail, and considerably more robust anatomy. According to Van Zandt, all the females depend on him to fertilize their eggs, meaning that the future of the species revolves around a single active individual. And although this system seems strange, it also helps explain how the dragons were able to multiply so rapidly after awakening. The most logical explanation is that many females and eggs were already lying dormant in different parts of the world, hidden inside caves or underground chambers. When the male awakened, he reactivated the species' reproductive cycle, either by mating with the females, fertilizing ancient clutches, or functioning as a biological trigger. That is why the population did not increase gradually, but in sudden waves that eventually filled the skies. The females could retain their eggs inside their bodies or deposit them in protected nests. The official 2002 video game expands on this idea by showing nests established inside abandoned human structures. In this way, the shelters built by humanity ultimately became breeding grounds for the species that was taking its place. And then another question arises: if the females can produce so many eggs, why do we see only one dominant male? The most likely answer is that the species regulates itself in a brutal way. The alpha male may eliminate other young males before they can mature. In nature, some animals that control reproductive groups attack rivals, drive away competitors, or kill offspring that threaten their dominance. Examples include lions and chimpanzees. Among the dragons, this behavior would serve the same purpose: maintaining a single reproductive center, preventing internal conflict, and ensuring that the species continues to follow a cycle dominated by its strongest individual. Obviously, that system is also their greatest weakness. If all reproduction depends on the male, then killing him means threatening the future of the species. It would not necessarily kill every existing dragon, but it would prevent the plague from continuing to multiply. That is why Van Zandt wants to travel to London. He knows that the origin of the plague lies there. The city where everything began has become the lair of the bull dragon. However, when Van Zandt launches the first attack, he fails. His group is almost completely destroyed in a single assault. The male proves that he is not only larger, but also more intelligent and patient, observing his enemies and waiting for the right moment to attack when he has the advantage. He then follows the attacker's trail back to the castle. That attack confirms that the dragons, especially the male, possess a far more developed animal intelligence than they initially appear to have. The destruction of the castle forces Quinn to stop hiding. For years, he had tried to survive by avoiding encounters with the creatures, but the situation no longer allowed him to continue doing so. The dragon that killed his mother had now also destroyed the refuge he built to protect his people. And so, at that point, the story comes full circle. Quinn returns to London, the same place where his trauma and the invasion began, but this time not as a lost child inside an excavation site, but as one of the few humans capable of bringing it all to an end. In London, the film shows that the dragons are also reaching the end of their active phase. The city is destroyed, filled with burned ruins and starving females. Food is scarce, and the male begins to devour them. This is crucial because it proves that the species is already entering its self-destructive stage. In the final battle, Quinn, Alex, and Van Zandt find themselves without support, and with only a few explosive bolts remaining. Even so, they have a plan and a very small chance of killing the male. To accomplish this, they must wait for him to open his mouth to breathe fire and shoot directly inside it. That area is especially vulnerable because it contains the glands that store the substances used to produce the flames. If the projectile detonated at precisely the right moment, it could rupture those organs, mix the compounds inside his throat, and turn the dragon's main weapon into the cause of his own death. Van Zandt manages to fire one of the explosive bolts at the male, but the detonation only succeeds in wounding him. Realizing that the attack has failed, he desperately launches himself at the creature with an axe and is ultimately devoured. Quinn, on the other hand, retrieves the final bolt and waits for the dragon to open his mouth to breathe fire. He then fires directly inside it, causing an explosion that destroys the creature from within. Although the film does not confirm that the projectile specifically struck his glands, the most likely explanation is that the detonation triggered a reaction between the flammable substances stored inside his throat. With the death of the male, the attacks cease. However, this does not mean that all the females died at that same moment. The millions of dragons that had filled the skies during the first years of the invasion had already declined considerably because of food shortages and cannibalism. By the time Quinn reaches London, the species is already in full collapse. The females are weakened, the male has begun devouring them, and the biomass available across the planet has been almost completely exhausted. The death of the bull dragon accelerates that process even further. With the disappearance of the only individual capable of fertilizing the eggs, the surviving females lose the ability to produce new waves of dragons. Some probably starved to death, others may have scattered, and the last survivors may have begun returning to hibernation. That is why, 3 months later, no new attacks had been reported, and the survivors were already raising antennas to establish contact with other communities. The world remained destroyed, the population had been decimated, and recovery was only beginning, but the expansion of the plague had been stopped. Even so, the film never confirms that all the dragons disappeared. If this species survived for millions of years and had already awakened during previous eras, it is possible that females, eggs, or even other young males remained hidden underground. Perhaps humanity merely interrupted the cycle. Perhaps it only eliminated the last dominant male. But as long as other sealed chambers exist in unknown locations, the possibility that another part of the species is still waiting cannot be ruled out. And that is precisely what makes the dragons of Reign of Fire such an interesting plague. They do not stand out solely because of their design or their more realistic ability to breathe fire, but because they function as a complete biological species connecting prehistory, medieval legends, and the collapse of the modern world. In the end, Reign of Fire is not simply about dragons attacking humanity. It is about the return of a species that turned extinction into part of its life cycle. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.